Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this UK launch of the 2015 Education for All Global Monitoring Report. Welcome. My name is Steve Packer. I'm the Executive Chair of UKFIET, the Forum for Education and Development, and we are co-convening this meeting with BASE, the British Association for International and Comparative Education, and Caroline Dyer is the chair of BASE. We're delighted to be here in what I now know I have to call the UCLIOE, I think. I feel reasonably at home, having been a graduate of both institutions. So it's nice to be back. We have the opportunity today to do two things, although they're quite closely connected. One is to learn from the 2015 report on the achievements and the challenges of the last 15 years since 2000. And to debate some of the conclusions that the report draws and which some of our panelists will analyze. And then secondly, we have the opportunity to look ahead to post-2015 at a very opportune moment, given that just a few weeks ago, and some of you have got this on your seats, there was issued the Incheon Declaration following the World Education Forum, and just even a few days ago, the zero draft of the Sustainable Goals Agenda to be agreed later this year, which includes reference to education, and we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, later in the day. We want to crack on quite quickly, so I'm going to hand you over to Caroline, who's going to chair the first half of the meeting. There'll be a very short break between the two sessions, the looking back and the looking forward, mainly to stretch or whatever. But it will be quite short because we've got a packed agenda to try and get us from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock this afternoon. Caroline.
Yes. Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction, and welcome everyone on behalf of the British Association for International and Comparative Education as well. We've held events like this in many places, and I think I've been to almost all of them, but I think this might be a first that we're having it in a posh tent. But I approve of alternative accommodation for educational events, as some of you who know me may know. So without further ado, I think we'll try and get the panel around the table. If our panel could come up, that would be great. Or do you want to start with you just sitting here? Okay, one downside of the posh tent is that the screen's not very, very big, but we hope that will be fine. We'll start with Aaron, who's got 20 minutes. He's been
25.
He thinks he's got 25. I said I'm going to start getting agonised at 20. 25 minutes then to present the key findings. I admire Aaron for his cheerfulness in the face of having been doing this for 1 year. I know it's a lot of work working on the GMR, and we're very much looking forward to this landmark presentation for 2015. Aaron.
So thank you very much to Caroline and to all the colleagues that have been involved in organizing this event. Let's see if I can get the presentation here up and going. 1 more minute. Okay. So this is truly an honor to be here in the UK for quite a few reasons. Mainly that this is a time for celebration. This is the 12th and the final Education for All Global Monitoring Report. This is the last of the EFA reports. And I'm very pleased to announce that there's a new series that will start up next not loud enough? No? It's okay? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? There'll be a new report series that will begin next year. We have received a mandate in part through the Incheon Declaration and working together with UNESCO to try to anchor the work of the new name that we've been given, the Global Education Monitoring Report, or GEM report, that will be starting next year. Indeed, it's much cause for celebration, in part because this has really been a collective effort. So many different people, especially here in the UK, have been involved in putting together these global reports, monitoring reports, since the year 2002, and many of the key actors are actually here in the room. And I think their work and efforts, and those of many members of the team, and also many people who have written background papers, who are also here in the room, are to be congratulated for their efforts, that we have collectively established ourselves as the international authoritative reference with respect to monitoring or tracking progress on key education targets, and also analyzing policy dimensions in many different countries and regions. So for me, it's important that we give thanks and say that this was not a fait accompli when it began 12 years ago, but indeed we've come quite a distance, and I think we all have. It's very interesting to be, and I feel very honored to be given this opportunity to represent many people that have contributed, as you can see here on the slide, to all the 11 former reports, including the one that we've just completed. So, moving into the substance of the report, because I've probably taken too long already with this introduction, we would first like to bring your attention to the fact that there are some very key findings of progress that have occurred since the year 2000. This report at the global level makes mention of these very key developments. We see many more children and adolescents who are now in school, and our calculation, or that of our colleagues at UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, would reveal that 84 million children and adolescents have gained access to education since Dakar over the last 15-year period. 52 million of these are girls, which has reduced gender disparities at the global level. 12 million more teachers have been recruited and deployed at both the primary and the secondary level, and there's been a 2/3 increase in the absolute number of young children that are enrolled in pre-primary or preschools at this level. One of the things that we did in this report was to try to capture the extent to which the trends after 2000 are different from those that had existed prior to this period of time. So we tried to see the extent to which, if you had continued the trends from the 1990s, what kind of progress could you have anticipated, and what kind of progress actually eventuated. And we came to the conclusion, based on this kind of analysis, that 34 million more children have gone to school, partly due to the intensive efforts of EFA supporters and institutions. Again, all of these are indications of progress, and certainly a source of optimism as we begin to establish a new vision for the next 15 years. But, and this is a big but, the three measurable targets of the EFA targets were not reached by all countries. Only a third of countries actually achieved the three measurable targets. This would be universal primary enrollment, gender parity at the primary and secondary level, and a 50% reduction in adult illiteracy. And even if we look at the one goal that has received so much attention, the UPE goal of universal primary education, only half of all countries for which we have data have achieved this particular goal. Another 10% are close to the target. And based on our most recent information, 121 million children and adolescents were still out of school. This is both at the primary and the lower secondary level in the year 2012, which is the most recent data that we have, non-projected data. And a third of the countries have yet to achieve primary gender parity at the primary level, and half of countries have not achieved gender parity at the secondary level. One of the main reasons for the lack of achieving the Education for All targets is due to major inequalities, both in education and elsewhere. We estimate in this report that the children who come from the poorest quintile of households are 4 times more likely to be out of school and 5 times more likely not to finish primary school as compared to those children who come from the richest quintile of households. We also see that conflict and armed violence has had a very adverse effect on many of the key education indicators, and indeed the proportion of out-of-school children who are living in either conflict-affected countries or conflict-affected zones has increased during the period of Dakar up until the most recent period that we have information. And when we look at learning outcomes, we see that in many countries there are very significant differences between some of the least advantaged and most marginalized children and those that are most advantaged, and in many cases these gaps in learning have increased. And if we look to adult literacy, in many ways the forgotten of the 6 EFA goals, it is the case that based on the more conventional statistics that we use, 781 million adults over the age of 15 are denied the right to literacy, 2/3 of which are women, and this proportion has gone unchanged over the last 12 years. So allow me then to quickly go through each of the 6 goals in some detail to give you an idea of where there has been progress. What I will be doing for each of these goals is to show some of the findings from our monitoring and also indicate countries that have made exemplary progress and some of the policies that have been put into place at the country level that are indicative of this progress, and then also indicate the key recommendations that the report makes with respect to each of these different goals or areas of education in each way. Now you'll understand, given that this is a 500-page report and this is a very brief presentation, that I can't give all the nuanced kind of information, both in terms of country specificity and also in terms of the recommendations, which is another way of saying and encouraging you to pick up the report and read it at length. The ECC goal is made up of 2 dimensions, the care dimension and the education dimension. And the care dimension, the main indicators here, have to do with child mortality rates being reduced and also looking at malnutrition and stunting figures. These are basically indicators from the Millennium Development Goal agenda. And here we see that there's been significant progress, although there are still many children, especially from some of the poorest countries and who hail from some of the most marginalized backgrounds, who are still in very difficult circumstances under the age of 5 and not receiving the kind of care due to them. If we look at pre-primary enrollments at the global level, we see there's been an increase, again, as I've indicated, of 2/3, from 112 million to 164 million. And although this goal did not have a particular target, we used an indicative target of an 80% gross enrollment rate at this level to begin to measure or rank countries on a particular scale. And based on this indicative target, we find that about a little less than half of the countries for which we have data have achieved an 80% enrollment rate at the pre-primary level. Another 8% are close to this target, but still almost half of all countries have yet to make significant progress on this goal. One of the points that we make in this report is to note that about 40 countries around the world have set aside 1 year of pre-primary education as part of their compulsory school cycle, which also you'll see is one of our recommendations. Most of these countries are in Latin America. In terms of the countries that we look at that have made significant progress, we mentioned Ghana that made compulsory pre-primary enrollment for 2 years, something that has occurred during this period. We look at the abolition of fees, the training of teachers, and the allocation of additional resources, all of which enabled Ghana to make very significant progress with respect to pre-primary education. We also make mention of South Africa and Indonesia that undertook policies that have significantly increased pre-primary enrollment in both of these countries. We also then use this information and other information to make very particular recommendations with respect to this level, this particular goal, that we think that at least 1 year of pre-primary education should be compulsory and should be provided as part of an extended basic education cycle. Governments should also support, in places where there isn't formal pre-primary education, non-formal and community-based early learning programs, and that there needs to be significant attention to the training of the staff to support the cognitive and social-emotional development of children at this level, and that the status of caregivers at this level needs to be made much more equal to the status and compensation given to primary school teachers as a way of bringing in more teachers to this level. Moving to the second goal, which I've indicated is perhaps the most visible of the 6 EFA goals. This is the goal that was also embedded in the Millennium Development Goals, although here we're looking at enrollments and not completion at the primary level. Based on enrollment rates, the net enrollment rate, we see that just over half of the countries for which we have information have achieved universal primary enrollment. And you can see in the bottom part of the figure a kind of a trend line, and here we see in particular significant progress in the region of South and West Asia. Much of this is due to the enormous efforts of India, of Bangladesh to some extent, and Nepal, all of which have moved very significantly in reducing the number of out-of-school children and have increased substantially the net enrollment rate at the primary level. There have also been significant improvements in sub-Saharan Africa that began quite low. The dotted lines, by the way, are making reference to projected trends based on data that we had up until 2012. There are significant inequalities that we refer to in this report. Once again, the importance, the impact of conflict and armed violence, the fact that many of the children with different kinds of disabilities are still being excluded from primary education, inequalities based on ethnic and linguistic backgrounds and minorities, girls who come from sparsely populated or rural areas, all of which are some of the key dimensions that have an impact on the fact that 57 million children at the primary level are still out of school based on our projection for 2015. And to the extent that we have information of looking at completion rates based on household surveys, we estimate that 100 million children will not complete primary school in 2015. And as I mentioned earlier, the proportion of these out-of-school children that live in conflict-affected countries has increased over time from 30% to 36%. Of the countries and contexts that we draw attention to in the report, in particular India, that reduced over the course of the last 12 years or 15 years the number of out-of-school children from 16 million to 1 million. These are based on international estimates, not the national figures for India. This is a reduction in out-of-school children that is without historical precedent. This involves many different initiatives that took place in India, including building schools, infrastructure, especially schools in sparsely populated parts of India in the rural areas, providing school feeding programs, and introducing some very important reforms in the curricula, and also providing latrines based on single-sex latrines, and also role models of female teachers. Very important also in parts of sub-Saharan Africa is the abolition of school fees that have increased enrollment at the primary level, and also the building up of many schools in Mozambique, as we make mention. Our recommendations are in line with these findings, that both primary and here lower secondary education that we see as part of this basic education cycle should be compulsory and fee-free, and there needs to be a true attempt to reduce all the costs, both the direct and indirect costs of accessing primary education with respect to reducing costs on textbooks, uniforms, and transportation. We also think that this is a very important place where the intersectorial Collaborations across sectors need to be examined to ensure that all children gain access to education, especially in areas, in remote areas. We talk about the importance of investing in infrastructure and using much more realistic cash transfer programs to incentivize those parents in poor households to send their children to school. Much of this is based on evidence from Latin America. And that there needs to be very clear contingency plans, especially in areas that are prone to conflict or to natural disasters, to meet the needs of children under these kinds of emergency conditions. Moving to the third EFA goal, which looks at skills for adolescents and for adults. This has been one of the more difficult goals for the team to monitor and measure for all kinds of different reasons. Here in this report, we use an indicative proxy indicator of the enrollment rate at the lower secondary level under the assumption that those children that gain access to lower secondary education begin to acquire skills that are relevant to their being able to move into the labor market and to have productive lives both in the workforce and in their families. Using this indicator, we see that only 45% of the countries for which we have data have achieved a net enrollment rate of 100% at this level. Another 9% of countries are close. If we look at especially, and here we're beginning to pay attention to the post-2015 target, especially 4.1, that talks about both universal primary and secondary education, and the completion of these two levels. One of the things that we did for this report was to engage in a series of projections of looking at, if we use trends for which we have information about completion rates at the primary, and in this case the lower secondary level, how many children from some of the low-income countries would arrive at a completion rate of about 100% in the next 15 years. Currently, 1 of 3 adolescents at the lower secondary level is able to complete. That means 2 out of 3 are not. And even if current trends continue, only half of adolescents at the lower secondary level would complete this level by 2030. So it gives you an idea of the scale of ambition that is embedded in the post-2015, one of the key targets, 4.1, around universal primary and secondary education. Here we make mention of 3 countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Rwanda, each of which has engaged in various kinds of policy initiatives and reforms to improve access to lower secondary education for children at this level in their countries. Some of this has to do with providing second chance opportunities for those children that may have left the system that wish to come back as adolescents. This is very important in Bangladesh through the BRAC and through other kinds of second chance programs. Some of this certainly at the initiative of civil society and not just governments. And also the fact that Rwanda has made many efforts to ensure the transition of many of their adolescents from primary to lower secondary education, and made considerable progress during this period of time. Our recommendations at this, for this level, first and foremost have to do with the fact that countries should be much clearer in defining the skills and competencies that students at this level are expected to acquire. This is not just at the lower secondary level, but at each level of education. We also show that there's an enormous impact to the extent that those countries that have ratified international conventions around a minimum age of employment, that these commitments should be enforced, and in doing so, many more children would remain in the school system. We also see very much the impact of part-time work for adolescents, and that those who stay full-time in the system are more likely to complete the lower secondary cycle. So this is also quite important. And indeed, much needs to be done to measure the kinds of skills and competencies that young people are acquiring as a result of their participation at the lower secondary level. Moving on to Goal 4, which, as I've indicated, is probably the forgotten and least attentive goal, both in terms of country policies, but also in terms of donor commitments. We find very few international donors who have set aside funds to specifically address the needs of adults to improve their literacy and numeracy skills and proficiencies, however defined and measured. Based on the conventional measures that we have from UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, only 23% of the 90 or so countries that had literacy rates below 95% have indeed reduced their rates by 50% over the course of this 15-year period, keeping in mind that literacy rates change much more slowly than do enrollment rates. We still, as I've indicated, a large number of absolute number that have not attained literacy, especially among women. And indeed, in sub-Saharan Africa, we estimate that half of all the women above the age of 15 in sub-Saharan Africa lack basic skills of reading and writing that allow them to function in their communities. One of the few examples that we have of significant and successful literacy campaigns are Nepal that were brought to scale that apparently did have an impact on improving literacy rates in that country. In most of the other countries that we see improvements in literacy rates, much of this is due to the fact that older people who tended to be less literate died off, where younger people who've been to school brought in their literacy levels into the adult population. So it's essentially a change in the composition of the adult population that produces the increase in the adult literacy rates rather than a dramatic impact of a campaign or some of the illiteracy programs. Having said that, we do make mention of Mexico and Cameroon that have carried out policies that have reached out to marginalized communities and that have sought to bring them into a greater pool of literacy and improve their skills. One of the key things that we make mention of in this particular part of the report is the importance of not having standalone literacy programs and campaigns, but rather seeing the literacy campaigns as being part of an integrated development strategy at the community level or even at the regional level. So those kinds of programs that help to improve, to provide adults with the opportunity to make use of their literacy skills that they've acquired in a more literate environment, whether it be at work or in some other kinds of activities, are very important for the retention of literacy skills once acquired. So we see very little evidence, only when adult literacy campaigns are well-resourced and integrated with broader development plans. We think that the international partners should work to ensure that this right to literacy is being realized and that it is included in the broader community development plans that are ongoing. We think that there is something to be gained from the use of mobile phones and other ICT platforms in this regard, also because of the different languages that adults can make use of in these platforms. And although I haven't written it here, clearly we think that one of the important things is the actual measurement on a scale, on a continuum, rather than using conventional statistics based on indirect assessment of literacy skills that has typically been the case up until now. The fifth goal that looks at gender parity and gender equality, here we see that despite this global movement toward greater gender parity, only only two-thirds of countries have reached gender parity at the primary level and only half of countries at the secondary level. This latter group is made up of two different kinds of countries, those in which girls are at a disadvantage relative to boys, which we see in certain parts of the global south, but in the global north, and in particular in Latin America and the Caribbean and parts of the OECD, we see that a lot of adolescent boys drop out of secondary level schools, and in fact there's a disadvantage of boys relative to girls at this level. The other issue that remains both difficult to measure, define, and to monitor has to do with gender equality. The report makes great attempts to look at many different kinds of indications of gender equality. There is no clear scale that we can use. This is clearly going to be one of the big challenges in the post-2015 targets and more generally in one of the Sustainable Development Goals that is set aside specifically to issues of gender equality. We mentioned several different countries here. Given the time constraints, I'm going to go through to the last part of my presentation. So the sixth goal here is around quality issues, which has obviously gained a lot of traction at many different levels in the international education community. One of the things that this report brings out is there are several countries that have been able to show significant improvement in access in addition to increasing learning outcomes, even for some of the most marginalized communities. We make mention of Ghana, Kenya, and Mexico in this regard. And one of the interesting findings that we compiled information about national learning assessments that go beyond the PISAs, the SACMEC, the PASEC, and some of the other international standardized learning assessment exercises. And we found that there's been a doubling of countries worldwide and in many different levels of development that have carried out at least one national learning assessment since Dakar, and there's been a fourfold increase in the actual number of such assessments. This figure is kind of interesting, or is very interesting, in part because much of the post-2015 agenda is about member states taking the lead in developing capacities to monitor progress with respect to learning and many other dimensions of education, and I think this shows the potential challenge that may be made use of in trying to develop capacities that currently exist and improve upon them rather than imposing some kind of international standardized examination. Okay, so I'm going to have to go through a lot of different slides here and ask you to look at the summary. I thought that I could go through these just a little bit quicker, but it's been a little bit difficult. So this is the information we have. By the way, this is the most recent information we have on international aid flows. You can see that in the last few years, since Dakar, there was a big increase, and then it leveled off from 2009. The last year, for which we have just gained information some weeks ago, shows a little bit of a blip upward, although it seems to be targeted in very particular countries and not part of a general trend. Very little of this international aid, by the way, goes for pre-primary education. Most of it is really focused on primary education. The other big finding that we bring out in this report is our attempt to cost out how much it would mean to achieve some of the key post-2015 targets. And what we did was to see what it would cost to universalize 1 year of pre-primary, all of primary, and a lower secondary education, and later we did it for upper secondary, and additional costing of quality issues and equity issues that we brought into it. It's a fairly complex exercise. We looked at how much countries are currently spending and how much aid is flowing through the system. And based on all this evidence, we come to the conclusion that there's a funding gap going forward if we are to achieve these very ambitious post-2015 educational targets that would require $22 billion to be found each year over the next 15 years in order to achieve not all, but some of the vast majority of the post-2015 targets. This includes up to universal lower secondary education. And if you include the transition to upper secondary education, although not the completion, it would be an additional $39 billion. Now, we might think this is a huge amount of money, and indeed it is, but one way to kind of put it in perspective is, as we've done here in this little figure, our icon on the side here, is to compare it to global, the annual amount of money going for military expenditures, and indeed the amount of money that we're making reference to here is 8 days of the global military expenditure. Currently in the post-2015 targets, there's no financing target, although there is in the Incheon Declaration, which is one of the differences between the two documents. So in closure, here's our conclusion, our verdict, our stock taking. We see that we did not reach education for all, even the most watch goal of universal primary education. We apparently have made accelerated progress, notably in getting millions of children and youth into school and reducing, in many countries, gender disparities. Those left behind are the most marginalized and vulnerable, and many millions are still not learning the basic, whether in school or not. Adult education and learning has been all but forgotten, and while country spending has risen, which I didn't show you, donor commitments have stalled, and certainly there's very little indication that they will increase in the years to come. Thank you very much for your attention.